For decades, Jack Nicholson always seemed the same man. The crooked smile, the half-amused, half-dangerous look, that feeling that he was always a few steps ahead of everyone else. Hollywood loved that image, the brilliant rebel, the genius actor, the man who lived unapologetically. But that was only the visible part, because while the public saw freedom, Jack lived something else, much more silent, much more controlled, and above all, hidden. For almost 30 years, and nobody talked about it, not because it was a well-kept secret, but because nobody put the pieces together. A strange comment in an old interview, a long relationship that ended abruptly, a son recognized too late, another never recognized, women who disappeared from the official story, close friends who deflected the subject. None of this in isolation seemed scandalous, but together, everything changed. Jack was born on April 22, 1937 in New Jersey, and he began life living a lie without knowing it. For years he believed his mother was his sister, and that his grandparents were his parents. This truth only came to light decades later as an adult. When a journalist investigated the family's past, there was no confrontation, there was no fight, only silence. And perhaps something that would stay with him forever was born there. The idea that reality can be edited, that truths can be hidden if it keeps everything running. Jack never talked much about it, but those who knew him said that, after this discovery, something changed. He didn't trust easily, he didn't explain himself, and he rarely allowed anyone complete access to his life. At the beginning of his career, this seemed like just a mystery. Charm, style. He stood out quickly. Intense roles, characters on the verge of collapse, men divided between control and chaos. The audience thought it was just acting, but it wasn't just that. In the 1970s, Jack was already a big name, and he was already living two versions of himself. The public one was known, parties, relationships, the reputation as a womanizer, the idea of a man who never commits. The private one, almost no one saw. He got deeply involved. He promised presence. He created real bonds, and at the same time he maintained enough distance to disappear when he needed to. Anjelica Huston stayed by his side for almost 20 years. It wasn't a quick fling, it was a shared life. And yet Jack never officially lived with her. He never married. He never built anything that seemed definitive. During this relationship, he had children with other women. Some acknowledged, others not. It didn't all come to light at once. It came in pieces, spread over decades. A son introduced years later. A daughter who only spoke about her father as an adult. A silent agreement here, another there. Jack never directly denied it, but he also never explained it. And that was curious, because he was a man who spoke very well, but chose silence when the subject was himself. Behind the scenes, friends said Jack had his own rules, nothing written down, but clear. Don't mix everything. Don't let one part of his life invade another. Don't allow anyone to have total control over him. For some, this seemed like freedom. For others, fear. Fear of being seen completely. Over time, the public image began to crystallize. Jack was the eccentric, the unpredictable, the difficult genius. It was comfortable to believe that. It was simple, much simpler than admitting that there were conscious choices behind that behavior. Nothing was as spontaneous as it seemed. Invitations to events were carefully selected. Interviews were controlled. Personal questions were humorously deflected. When someone got too close, he distanced himself, always. And so, decade after decade, Jack Nicholson maintained two narratives simultaneously, that of the indomitable icon, and that of the man who never allowed himself to be fully reached. The public didn't understand, or preferred not to notice. Until, as the years passed, some stories began to emerge together. And for the first time, the questions ceased to be uncomfortable and became inevitable. Who was Jack Nicholson, really, when no one was watching? And what did he spend almost 30 years trying to keep separate from the world? In the next chapter, this parallel life begins to take shape. Not as a scandal, but as a choice. Jack Nicholson always knew how to separate things, work on one side, private life on the other, and between them a wall thick enough to keep most people out. This didn't come with fame. It was learned much earlier. After discovering the truth about his own family, Jack became protective of his inner world. Not in a poetic way, in a defensive way. He understood deeply that reality could be rearranged, that silence could be safer than honesty. By the time the 1970s arrived and his career began to explode, that instinct had turned into a system. He fell in love. Often, he committed, up to a point. And he always kept an exit. People close to him noticed the pattern early. Jack could be fully present one week, deeply affectionate, attentive, intense, and then vanish. Days, sometimes weeks, no warning, no explanation. To outsiders, it looked careless. To those inside, it felt intentional. Jack wanted closeness but not permanence. He liked intimacy but resisted being known completely. And over time, that contradiction shaped every serious relationship he had. Angelica Houston was the longest and clearest example. They were together for nearly 2 decades, not casually, not briefly. This was shared life, holidays, losses, real attachment. And yet they never built what most people would call a settled life. No marriage, no single home that felt permanent. Always space, always distance. During that relationship, Jack had others, not loudly, not publicly, but consistently, and some of those relationships had consequences that couldn't remain invisible forever. Children. Jack Nicholson became a father multiple times, with different women over many years. Some children were acknowledged early, some much later, and at least one was never publicly recognized at all. There was no explosive scandal, no courtroom drama, no screaming headlines. Everything unfolded quietly. Private agreements, financial support, controlled contact, presence without visibility. To Jack, being responsible did not require being emotionally available. He believed care could exist at a distance, that providing meant protecting, even if that protection looked like absence. That belief disturbed some people close to him. Others accepted it. A few carried lasting resentment, but almost none spoke publicly. Because Jack inspired loyalty, not loyalty bought with money, loyalty built through consistency. He helped friends. He showed up when it mattered. He didn't abandon people entirely. He simply kept a part of himself, sealed off. Always. In Hollywood, this wasn't exactly a secret, but it wasn't a scandal either. Jack wasn't labeled cruel. He was labeled complicated, difficult, a man who lived by his own rules. For a long time, that explanation was enough. But as years passed, cracks began to show. His film roles became darker, more fractured, men driven by control, paranoia, obsession, characters hiding something fundamental. Some people started to notice the echo. Jack wasn't choosing these roles by accident. On sets, colleagues noticed his precision, his control, his refusal to improvise emotionally when it threatened the structure he needed. Nothing chaotic was truly allowed near him. Behind the scenes, his personal life followed the same pattern. Separate homes, different social circles. People who never crossed paths. Jack never allowed the full picture to exist in one room, and that wasn't fear of scandal. It was fear of exposure. Exposure meant questions. Questions meant loss of control, and control mattered to Jack more than affection. That instinct may have started long before Hollywood, with a boy who grew up believing one version of his family, only to learn later it wasn't true. A boy who learned that truth doesn't always protect you. Sometimes silence does. Jack Nicholson mastered that silence. To the public, he was the untamed icon. To the press, the unpredictable genius. To those close to him, a man who never fully lowered his guard. And for decades it worked. Until time did what it always does. Children grew up. Former partners aged. Memories lost their urgency but gained weight. And slowly stories began to surface, not as accusations, as recollections, details shared without anger, without drama, just facts. That's when the image began to shift, because a pattern, once visible, cannot be unseen. And the question changed, not whether Jack Nicholson lived freely, but how carefully he lived divided. And who paid the price for that division? In the next chapter, one voice breaks the silence, not to accuse, but to finally tell the story that lived in the margins for 30 years. Jack Nicholson didn't just live one private life, he lived several, and each woman around him knew a different version of the man. That wasn't accidental. Jack was careful about how much of himself he showed, and to whom. With some women he was warm, funny, deeply attentive. With others, distant but reliable. With a few, almost ghost-like. Present, then gone. Rarely cruel, rarely loud, almost never confrontational. He didn't explode. He withdrew. Angelica Houston once said something that stayed with people who heard it. She described Jack not as a villain, not even as unfaithful in the traditional sense, but as someone who never belonged fully to anyone. Not because he couldn't love, but because he wouldn't anchor himself. Their relationship lasted close to 20 years. That alone says something. This wasn't a fling, this wasn't chaos. They shared routines, friends, losses, long stretches of ordinary life. Yet there was always an understanding, mostly unspoken, that Jack moved according to his own gravity. And when he moved, others adjusted. During their years together, Jack fathered children with other women. This wasn't hidden from Angelica forever. It surfaced slowly, quietly, without dramatic confrontations the public ever saw. The relationship didn't end immediately. It eroded. Trust didn't break in one moment. It thinned. Angelica later admitted that the final rupture came when Jack had a child with another woman while still deeply involved with her. Not because the act shocked her, but because it confirmed something she had resisted accepting for years. Jack's life had compartments, and she was not the only one inside them. Other women experienced this from different angles. Some described him as generous, even gentle. He listened. He remembered details. He showed up at important moments. He didn't humiliate or belittle. That made his disappearances harder to understand. Others described long periods of silence, no arguments, no closure, just absence. Calls unanswered, doors not opened, plans dissolving without explanation. Jack didn't end relationships the way most people do. He let them fade. And when they faded, he rarely looked back publicly, privately maybe, but never in a way that required accountability. There were rumors, of course. Hollywood is built on them. Jack was linked to actresses, models, writers. Some connections were real, some exaggerated, some completely invented. But the pattern didn't lie. Jack avoided permanence, avoided public commitment, avoided the kind of emotional exposure that can't be controlled. Marriage never tempted him again after his early divorce. Living arrangements stayed flexible. No shared identity, no shared image. Even when he loved someone, he kept a private exit unlocked. That choice protected him. It didn't always protect the people around him. Several women stayed silent for decades, not out of fear, out of resignation. Jack Nicholson was not someone you exposed. He was someone you survived, processed, and moved on from. Speaking publicly felt unnecessary, and sometimes pointless, because Jack never denied his nature. He just never explained it. Friends noticed that he treated breakups the same way he treated most conflicts, by minimizing them, by refusing to dramatize, by stepping away before emotions demanded answers. And that calm, that refusal to explode, often made him look like the reasonable one. That's how a double life can exist without scandal. Not through deception alone, but through restraint. Jack rarely lied outright. He simply didn't offer the whole truth, and without the whole truth, no single person could challenge the full picture. Until years later. As time passed, some women began telling their stories not to accuse, but to clarify, to explain their own silence, to make sense of decades that felt confusing, even in memory. And what emerged was consistent. Jack was not reckless. He was precise. He curated intimacy the same way he curated roles, carefully, selectively, always on his terms. That precision cost him something too. Friends noticed that as he aged, his circle narrowed, relationships became fewer, distance grew easier than closeness. He protected himself so well that he began to live inside that protection. The man who seemed untouchable grew isolated, and that isolation wasn't visible on red carpets. It showed up in empty rooms, in long stretches without companionship. Inner reliance on routine instead of connection. But even then, Jack didn't change the structure of his life, because structures, once built, are hard to dismantle. In the next chapter, the focus shifts again, away from romance, away from relationships, toward the role Jack Nicholson played most carefully of all, the role of father. Jack Nicholson never talked much about fatherhood, not because he was ashamed, but because talking about it would have required precision he wasn't ready to offer. Publicly, he acknowledged being a father. Privately, he handled it in his own way, quietly, selectively, carefully managed. Jack had children with different women over many years. This wasn't a secret, but the timeline was never clear. The relationships behind those children were rarely discussed, and the role he played in their daily lives remained vague. Some of his children grew up knowing who their father was. Others grew up knowing about him, but not with him. There's an important difference. Jack believed presence could be defined flexibly. He believed support didn't need to look traditional. To him, being responsible meant providing security, not routine, stability, not proximity. He paid for education. He opened doors when he could. He used his influence carefully, but he didn't become a constant figure. To some of his children, Jack was a voice on the phone, an occasional dinner, a name that carried weight but not warmth. To others, he was a distant but respected presence, never cruel, never fully available, no reports of abuse, no dramatic abandonments, just distance. And distance, sustained over decades, becomes a language of its own. One of his daughters later spoke about meeting him as an adult and trying to understand how to relate to a man who felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Another child chose a life largely outside the public eye, avoiding interviews, avoiding discussion altogether. Jack never forced a narrative. He didn't correct the stories, didn't deny them, didn't fill in the gaps. That silence was consistent with everything else. Those close to him said Jack was afraid of becoming his father in one very specific way. Not in terms of talent or public influence, but in terms of being overshadowing. He didn't want to define his children's lives so strongly that they couldn't escape him. That may have been the story he told himself, or it may have been a justification, because while absence can feel less intrusive than dominance, it leaves questions unanswered. And unanswered questions tend to linger. Jack's children grew up watching his films, watching the world celebrate him, watching strangers praise a man they barely knew. Some felt proud, some felt confused, some felt both. And Jack, aware of this, didn't step in to correct it. He believed everyone must build their own relationship with reality, even if that reality included gaps. Friends noticed that Jack spoke of his children differently than most parents, less sentimentally, more abstractly. He didn't share stories, didn't linger on milestones. Not because he didn't care, but because he compartmentalized. He kept fatherhood in a quiet box, the same way he kept romance, fear, and regret in other boxes. As the years went on, this structure hardened. Jack became more private, less social. His public appearances became rarer. His circle shrank. His attention narrowed. Some of his children tried to bridge the gap later in life. Some didn't. Some accepted the relationship as it was. Some struggled against it. Jack responded the same way every time. Calm, polite, reserved, never defensive, never emotional, never fully open. And that consistency made things clearer. Jack wasn't avoiding fatherhood. He was redefining it on his own terms. The problem with private definitions is that they don't always translate well to other people's needs. By the time Jack began retreating from acting, the consequences of his choices were already written. Not dramatically, quietly. Family gatherings were limited, celebrations were small, public photos rare. The double life wasn't about scandal anymore. It was about separation. A man who had spent decades maintaining control found himself surrounded by silence. Not hostile silence, just absence. He had built a life where nothing could hurt him deeply, and in doing so, had limited how deeply he could connect. The irony wasn't lost on those close to him. Jack Nicholson, the actor known for emotional extremes, lived a personal life defined by restraint. No explosive conflicts, no public breakdowns, no desperate confessions, just a long, deliberate distance. In the next chapter, That distance collides with something he could never fully control. Time. Age changes how secrets work. It changes what can be maintained and what inevitably begins to surface. For a long time, Jack Nicholson's system worked. Silence, distance, carefully chosen appearances. But time does something no amount of control can prevent. It loosens structures. As Jack grew older, the gaps in his life became more visible, not to the tabloids at first, to the people around him. Friends noticed changes before the public did. He stopped returning calls. He cancelled plans he once enjoyed. The houses that used to feel like refuges became quiet. Too quiet. This wasn't scandal, it was retreat. Jack didn't announce his withdrawal from Hollywood, he simply faded. One year he was everywhere, the next almost nowhere. For a man who built his life around separation, aging removed one essential tool: energy. Managing multiple worlds takes effort, and effort becomes expensive with time. People began asking questions, not aggressive ones, curious ones. Why hadn't he acted in years? Why did no one see him socially anymore? Why were only a few people allowed inside his circle? Stories started to surface. Again, not explosively, slowly. Former partners spoke in interviews about long silences. Children mentioned seeing him rarely. Friends hinted that he preferred isolation to complication. None of this was new. But now it was visible. Jack's public image shifted without him saying a word. The rebellious icon slowly became the reclusive legend. A man who once commanded rooms now avoided them. And this is where the double life became something else, not hidden, just unresolved. In earlier years, distance had looked intentional, strategic. As Jack aged, it began to look defensive. There's a difference. Intentional distance says, "This is my choice." Defensive distance says, "I don't know how to change this anymore." Those closest to him said Jack had moments of clarity about it, small ones. He would acknowledge regret without naming it. He'd say things like, "I probably could have done some things better." Then stop, no elaboration, no confession. Jack didn't revisit the past publicly. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't grant reflective interviews. Reflection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing Jack never rehearsed. As years passed, his children aged into their own identities. Some stepped into the industry. Some stayed far away from it. Interviews became unavoidable, and their words were careful. They spoke of him without anger, without bitterness, but with distance that echoed his own. Statements like, "We had a relationship, but it wasn't traditional," or "He was around when it mattered, just not often." That honesty was gentle and devastating, because it suggested something Jack may not have intended, that his absence wasn't dramatic enough to rebel against, just consistent enough to accept. Hollywood legends usually end with retrospectives, documentaries, tributes, long reflections on legacy. Jack Nicholson's legacy formed differently. It lived in silence, in unanswered questions, in stories that never exploded, only accumulated. Fans began to notice that the man who played characters desperate for control had in real life tried to master the same thing: emotion, exposure, attachment, and control carried long enough becomes a habit. Habits harden. Hardened habits rarely adapt. That's when rumors started again. Quieter than before, less glamorous. Was he lonely? Was he estranged? Was he unhappy? No one could answer clearly, because Jack didn't offer clarity. Those who visited him described long conversations that never crossed certain lines. He spoke about films, politics, sports, anything but the past. The double life had become one life narrowed, not tragic, but diminished. And that's the part people struggle with. There was no single moment where everything collapsed, no scandal forced into the open, just time, revealing limits. Jack Nicholson lived for decades believing separation was protection, and in many ways it was. It protected him from chaos, from public judgment, from emotional overload. But it also protected him from connection, and by the time that realization might have mattered most, it was no longer something he could easily undo. In the next chapter, the story reaches its quiet conclusion. Not with accusation, not with drama, but with the question that remains when a life carefully managed finally slows down. What does legacy look like when it's built on distance? When Jack Nicholson stopped appearing, he didn't announce it. No farewell tour, no final statement, no explanation. He simply became still. For someone who spent decades controlling narratives, that silence felt intentional, almost defiant, as if stepping away without comment was the last form of control he had left. Hollywood reacted the way it always does. At first speculation, then nostalgia, then acceptance. People spoke about Jack in the past tense long before he was gone. They replayed the roles, the grin, the rage, the brilliance. They reduced his life to scenes and lines because scenes and lines are easier than questions. But privately, the questions stayed. What kind of life had he really lived? What did he leave unfinished? Those closest to him noticed something subtle. Jack didn't regret his career, not at all. He was proud of the work, proud of the risks, proud of the chaos he brought to the screen. What he never addressed openly was the personal cost. In rare moments among trusted friends, he hinted at it, not emotionally, practically. He would say things like, "You can't do everything," or "You make choices and live with them." Those weren't apologies, they were acknowledgements. Jack had always believed that too much closeness would blur his edges, that emotional exposure would dilute his instincts. That distance preserved clarity. That belief served him well creatively. It did not always serve him humanly. As his world narrowed, he didn't try to rebuild it. He didn't attempt late-life reinventions. He didn't seek reconciliation through public gestures. He stayed consistent. That consistency made it difficult for anyone to fully label his life a success or a failure. Because success depends on what you value. If you value autonomy, Jack won. If you value control, Jack won. If you value independence, Jack won. But if you value connection, if you value being known, the answer becomes less certain. Jack Nicholson never lived loudly wrong. He lived quietly divided, and that division shaped everything. The roles he chose, the relationships he limited, the family ties he kept at arm's length. He avoided collapse, avoided scandal, avoided humiliation, but he also avoided surrender. And surrender is often where intimacy begins. His children grew older carrying their own interpretations of him, not dramatic ones, personal ones, each different, each incomplete. Some admired him deeply, some accepted him cautiously, some loved him at a distance. None described him as cruel. That distinction matters. Jack Nicholson wasn't a man who destroyed people. He was a man who withheld himself, and withholding can hurt just as much, sometimes more, because there's nothing to fight against. No villain, no explosion, just absence. As the years passed, public conversation softened. People stopped asking invasive questions. The mystery became part of the legend. He was allowed to age privately, to retreat, to exist without explanation. And maybe that was the ending he wanted. A life not corrected, not reinterpreted, not redeemed, just concluded. But even quiet endings leave echoes. In the next chapter, we return to the beginning. Not to rewrite it, but to see it clearly. Because when a man lives two lives for 30 years, the truth isn't in what he hid, it's in why he hid it. To understand Jack Nicholson's double life, you have to stop looking for scandal. There wasn't a single secret powerful enough to explain everything, no moment where the truth would suddenly shock the world. What mattered was something quieter. Fear. Not the obvious kind. Not fear of failure or rejection. A deeper one. Fear of being fully seen. That fear didn't begin with fame. It began long before cameras followed him. It began with the first truth that shaped his understanding of the world. The moment he learned that the story he'd lived inside wasn't real. For most of his childhood, Jack believed he knew who he was, who his family was, where he came from. Then, as an adult, that certainty dissolved, not through confrontation, through discovery, a journalist, a question, a fact. And suddenly, the ground shifted. People close to Jack later said that after this revelation, he changed in subtle ways. He didn't become bitter. He didn't lash out. He became careful, observant, selective. He learned something early that most people don't learn until much later, if ever. That truth doesn't always arrive gently, and once it arrives, it can't be undone. From that moment on, Jack treated identity as something flexible, adjustable, something you protect by choosing what stays visible and what stays hidden. Hollywood rewarded that instinct. The industry doesn't favor men who are fully open. It favors those who maintain mystique. Jack understood that better than most. He didn't just act mysterious, he lived mysteriously. Distance became part of his brand. Privacy became power. Silence became control. But control always asks for payment. The more Jack curated his life, the less room there was for spontaneity. The more walls he built, the fewer people were allowed past them. Relationships required negotiation, boundaries, rules that were rarely spoken but always enforced. He didn't want to be trapped in expectations. He didn't want to be obligated emotionally. He didn't want to be needed in ways he couldn't regulate. That doesn't mean he didn't care. It means he rationed himself. Jack gave portions, never the whole. And that decision repeated everywhere. In romance, in fatherhood, in friendship. He was present but not immersed, supportive but not dependent, engaged but never exposed. Some people admired this. They saw it as strength, as discipline, as refusal to be consumed. Others felt its cost, because intimacy doesn't thrive in portions. It thrives in risk. Jack avoided risk in his personal life even as he embraced it on screen. That contradiction wasn't accidental. On screen, danger ended when the camera stopped rolling. In real life, danger left scars. So he kept his life compartmentalized. If one part collapsed, the others could continue. If a relationship failed, it wouldn't take everything with it. That's how someone survives long enough to live two lives for 30 years. Not through lies, through separation. But separation has a side effect. It dulls extremes, both pain and joy. As Jack aged, that dullness became more noticeable. Friends said his highs weren't as high. His lows weren't dramatic. Everything flattened. He was calm, consistent, and deeply guarded. He lived in beautiful houses that felt quiet even when occupied. He surrounded himself with art, music, films, things that asked nothing of him emotionally. People came and went. The walls stayed. And maybe that was enough for him. Because not everyone seeks the same form of fulfillment. Jack wasn't chasing belonging. He was chasing autonomy. He didn't want to be defined by anyone, not a partner, not a family role, not even his children. He wanted to remain singular. That's not a moral failing. It's a choice. But every choice leaves something behind. When people say Jack Nicholson lived a double life, they imagine deception, affairs, secrets, hidden chaos. The truth is less dramatic. He lived a divided life, by design. One side for the world, one side for himself, and very few allowed to see both. In the final chapter, the story doesn't end with revelation. It ends with reflection, not about what Jack Nicholson hid, but about what remains when a life built on distance finally slows down. When the noise finally fades, a life becomes much simpler to see. No premieres, no cameras, no expectations to perform, just a man, and the shape of the choices he made. Jack Nicholson didn't end his story with a collapse. There was no scandal powerful enough to force everything open, no final confession, no moment where the truth came spilling out all at once. Instead, his life slowed down. And slowing down does something brutal. It removes distraction. When Jack stepped away from acting, he also stepped away from the last place where emotional intensity was allowed without consequence. On screen, rage had purpose, desire had structure, conflict had an ending. Off-screen, things were quieter, unscripted, less forgiving. People close to him said his days became routine, predictable. Safe, he followed habits, watched old films, read, listened, observed, still the observer. Always. There's something revealing about how a man spends his time when no one is watching. Jack didn't chase reinvention. He didn't seek redemption arcs. He didn't reach out publicly to correct narratives. He let the story settle where it landed. That tells you something. Jack Nicholson never needed to be understood by everyone. He only needed to be left alone, and in many ways he achieved that. The world remembers the performances, the grin, the volatility, the brilliance, the characters who screamed, seduced, threatened, laughed too loudly. Those characters felt exposed, raw, uncontrolled. The man behind them was the opposite, controlled, measured, careful. That contrast is the key to everything. When people talk about Jack Nicholson's double life, they imagine contradiction. They imagine chaos behind the curtain, but the truth is quieter and harder to judge. Jack didn't live wildly behind closed doors. He lived narrowly. He trimmed away anything that threatened to overwhelm him. Relationships that demanded too much, roles that would trap him, expectations that required constant explanation. What remained was manageable. And maybe that was enough, but manageable is not the same as full. As the years passed, the world began to look at Jack differently, not as a myth, as a man shaped by restraint. People asked softer questions. Was he lonely? Was he satisfied? Did he ever wonder what it would have been like to live without so many walls? No one knows, because Jack didn't answer questions like that, and maybe he didn't need to. Some lives are built around intensity, others around avoidance of it. Jack's was the second. He wasn't running from love. He was rationing it. He wasn't hiding secrets. He was limiting exposure. That's not a story with a clean moral. It doesn't tell you who to admire or who to blame. That leaves you with something quieter, a realization that a person can be successful, admired, envied, and still live partially untouched, that someone can give the world unforgettable emotion while guarding their own fiercely. Jack Nicholson lived two lives not because he was dishonest, but because he believed wholeness was dangerous. And perhaps in his own way, he was right. Wholeness requires surrender. It requires mess. It requires letting things collide. Jack never let them collide. When the curtain finally lowered, what remained wasn't a mystery that needed solving. It was a structure that made sense once you stopped expecting drama. A man who chose distance over chaos, control over connection, privacy over exposure, and paid the quiet price of that choice. His story doesn't end with shock. It ends with reflection. Because the real question isn't whether Jack Nicholson lived a double life. The question is this: how much of yourself do you have to protect before protection becomes isolation? And how much distance can a life absorb before it starts to feel empty? That answer is different for everyone. Jack made his choice early, and he lived with it to the end. Not loudly, not tragically, just deliberately. And sometimes that's the most revealing ending of all.